Something about this World Cup never added up. The lights were too bright, the stadiums too perfect, the celebration too polished, as if the world was being asked to admire the spectacle and ignore the shadow behind it. Because beneath the fireworks and the confetti, there was a question that never went away. Who really paid for the most profitable World Cup in history? And why does FIFA still struggle to answer that without looking away? This is not a small story tucked into the margins of sport. This is a story about billions of dollars, millions of viewers, 8 stadiums, 1 host nation, and a governing body that says football belongs to everyone, while its biggest event left the people who built it fighting for wages, recognition, and answers after a death. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the Qatar World Cup became more than a tournament, more than a month of football. It became a test of memory and power. And if you want coverage that follows the story past the trophy lift and into the places most cameras never linger, subscribe now, because what comes next is the part they hoped would fade. At the center of all of this is one contradiction, and everything revolves around it. FIFA spent years presenting the 2022 World Cup as proof that football could unite the planet, modernize a region, and leave a positive legacy. But the deeper, investigators, labor groups, and the workers themselves looked, the more another reality pushed through. A tournament built on promises of progress, yet surrounded by unresolved claims of wage theft, recruitment debt, unexplained deaths, and compensation that never matched the scale of the harm. That is the contradiction. Celebration on the surface, unanswered cost underneath, glory above, silence below. And the numbers make that contradiction impossible to dismiss. FIFA reported record revenue of $7.57 billion for the 2019 to 2022 cycle. More than 3.18 million tickets were sold. The tournament drew over 5 billion viewers across platforms. It became the most watched and commercially successful World Cup FIFA had ever staged. It sold rights and partnerships on a scale previous tournaments could barely approach. The machine worked. It worked spectacularly. Money flowed. Audiences watched. History was made. But here is where it changes completely. When human rights groups called for a compensation program for migrant workers harmed while preparing and servicing the tournament, FIFA never produced a remedy that matched the size of the event it was celebrating. Think about that for a moment. Record revenue on one side, families chasing unpaid wages and death certificates on the other, global outrage on the other, a governing body insisting it cared while those who carried the burden kept hearing that someone else was responsible. That is not a detail, that is the story. Pull back further, and the picture grows darker. Qatar's World Cup was never just about the stadiums. It was about the roads, airport, transport systems, hotels, cleaning crews, security workers, and the invisible workforce required to make a mega event look effortless. For years, rights groups documented patterns that kept repeating. Delayed salaries, unpaid wages, confiscated passports, crushing recruitment debt, barriers to changing jobs, dangerous working conditions, and deaths often written off in vague language that answered nothing. Cardiac arrest, natural causes, sudden failure, phrases that close files, phrases that end scrutiny, phrases that leave families with no explanation and, too often, no compensation. One family's story says more than a press release ever could. A Nepali worker named Kripal Mandal went to Qatar to support his wife and 5 children, doing what so many workers do when opportunity at home collapses and risk abroad feels like the only option left. His family said he worked in construction for a company assigned to the airport and stadiums. Then he died in 2022. His widow, Manju Devi, was left with loans, children, uncertainty, and the terrible emptiness that comes when the person who carried the household is suddenly gone. No ceremony, no speech from a president, just debt, grief, and a question hanging in the air. What happened? And who is responsible when the event moves on but the family cannot? And that is just one name in a system built on scale. Thousands of workers, thousands of stories, thousands of journeys from Nepal, Bangladesh, India, Kenya, and beyond, passing through recruiters, contracts, dormitories, heat, debt, and hope. Some got paid late, some were not paid at all. Some returned home with less than they arrived with. Some never returned home alive. But that is just the beginning, because the real controversy is not only what happened, it is what happened after the world knew. By 2016 and 2017, FIFA had adopted human rights commitments and a formal policy. Officials spoke the language of responsibility. Reports were commissioned. Advisory structures existed. The words were there. The framework was there. The awareness was there. And yet when campaigners called on FIFA and Qatar to establish a broad remedy program, including a fund comparable to the $440 million in World Cup prize money, the answer never became a clear yes. It became deflection. It became process. It became delay. Before we go deeper, if this is the kind of coverage you have been looking for, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what is coming next is exactly where the official narrative begins to crack. In late 2022, on the eve of the tournament, pressure peaked. Rights groups said the existing compensation mechanisms in Qatar were too narrow, too difficult to access, and too limited for deaths, injuries, and historic wage theft across the World Cup era. Workers who had already left the country faced even more obstacles, and so did families abroad. If a death was classified as natural or non-work related, compensation claims could collapse before they began. That was the reality critics kept pointing to. Not the existence of a fund on paper, but the gap between the fund on paper and justice in real life. FIFA's public posture shifted in ways that only deepened suspicion. At one point, officials signaled openness to compensation. Then, as the opening match approached, the message hardened. FIFA pointed toward existing Qatari mechanisms and announced a legacy fund for education and labor initiatives, but not a remedy centered on workers and families who had already suffered. Sit with that. A legacy fund without the people who paid the price. A legacy conversation without the people who carried the load. A legacy for the future, while the past remained unpaid. And this is why FIFA still cannot explain the situation in a way that settles it. Because the problem is not just legal, it is moral. If you can count every ticket, every sponsor, every hospitality package, every viewer, every dollar, how do you suddenly lose clarity when the conversation turns to the workers who made the event possible? If football is truly for everyone, why do some people only seem to matter once they are in the stands, not when they are on the scaffolding? If this was a triumph of global sport, why does the legacy still feel unfinished the moment you ask who was left behind? This is the bigger picture. The Qatar World Cup did not only reveal something about one host nation, it revealed something about modern sport itself. Mega events are sold as miracles, wrapped in vision, architecture, diplomacy, and national pride. They promise transformation, they promise connection, they promise history. But too often, the people who build that history are edited out of the final cut. The camera pans to the trophy, then the fireworks, rarely back to the labor camp, the debt, the widow, the unexplained death, the missing wages, the unanswered letter. That is the disappearing act. That is the vanishing point. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So when people ask why this World Cup situation still follows FIFA, the answer is simple. Because success does not erase responsibility. Because spectacle does not cancel suffering. Because a final whistle does not end a moral question. It only makes the silence louder. And now the question moves to all of us. What kind of legacy counts as a legacy if the people who built it are still waiting to be heard? What does reform really mean if accountability always arrives late, partial, or not at all? Tell us what you think in the comments. Like the video if you believe sport should be judged not only by what it celebrates, but by what it hides. Subscribe if you want more investigations that follow the money, the power, and the human cost all the way to the end. Because the trophy was lifted, the crowd went home, and the world moved on. But some questions did not move. Some questions stayed, and FIFA still cannot explain them away.